Welcome once again to our lectures on ethics and culture. This week we turn to Nietzsche's complex views on morality. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was a 19th century German philosopher who lived from 1844 to 1900s. He was not only a philosopher, he was a philologist, a classical philologist, a critic, composer, poet, whose works have exerted and continue to exert a profound influence on modern intellectual history. Um, he was, once again, like many of the previous philosophers we have encountered, a precociously brilliant young individual, became the youngest person to ever hold the chair of classical philology or classical studies, Greek literature, history, and so on. So he was the youngest person to ever hold the chair of philology at the University of Basel in 1869 when he was only 24 years old. He resigned a decade later in 1879 due to health problems that had plagued him throughout his life. Uh, and it's in the following decade, what he calls the middle period of his life, that he composed all of his sort of core works, for which he's extremely well known. In another decade, and over the following decade, from about 1879 to 1889, around which time, at the age of 44, he suffered a major collapse. And afterward, by and large, lost most of his sort of mental faculties and spent the remaining years until 1900, first in the care of his mother and then his sister. So today we turn to some of his rather complex views on morality. As we'll see throughout this lecture and the next one, it is not easy to pin down Nietzsche's exact views on morality. Firstly, they're quite scattered all over, scattered in many places, from his early uh, exceptional 1873 essay entitled On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, where we already get a taste or elements of his critique of the Kantian absolutism and social contract, civil society theories of morality, to his more extended, like in his more mature period, his extended critique of Christian, European, even utilitarian morality, and his um, enjoining or extolling a sort of higher or revaluation of values in modern society. So, as we'll see as we go on the one hand, he seems to be extremely critical, not necessarily of a particular uh, moralities, although he will particularly criticize Christian, utilitarian, Kantian moralities, but rather he seems to be getting at something that's characteristic of all these moralities, rather than just simply attacking one of them. Something that's characteristic of all of these, what he calls traditional moralities, uh, that he wants to point out and critique, something that's characteristic of all of these. And at the same time, he is extolling something refers to almost as a higher morality, or sometimes the term has been used master morality, and so on. Yet, as we'll see later, he uses the same term, morality, both to talk about all of these traditional morality that he finds at fault, and yet he uses the same term, demoral or moralitet, to talk about the sorts of morality he wants to sort of extol or propose. So the same term is being used both in his critique and in his idea of what morality should be. So this will remain one of our questions. What is he trying to get at? So anyway, so in this two lectures, we'll just try to capture a brief snapshot of this. We won't uh, turn to a large part of his more in-depth analysis of our critique of morality. Rather, we'll focus on this sort of one central set of ideas that's been commonly associated with the sort of Nietzschean approach to morality, which has to do with his sort of strong critique of Christian morality and what he refers to as a revaluation of morality. So this will sort of be our transvaluation of morality. This will be our theme in this lecture and going into the next lecture. Now, one of the first places to start with Nietzsche's views on morality is to understand that he does not necessarily he does not begin by trying to define morality, or he does not treat morality as some absolute given, or self-evident, or something we can figure out a priori by the use of our reason to arrive at some universal principles, as we have seen some earlier philosophers, particularly Kant. Just last week we went through this. Rather, he looks at morality itself as a product or outcome of, or moral values, morality as a product of or outcome of past historical uh, conditions. And so something that he argues, something that uh, in a sense resist any sort of overarching or absolute definition. As he puts it, only something which has no history can be defined. Whereas in his case, he'll try to point out morality as we know it, our outcomes are created, interpreted under deeply human historical conditions. So values cannot be taken out of these particular socioeconomic, political, historical conditions in which they have emerged through processes of contestation, as we'll see. That it's past struggles over what is good, what is bad, what is good, what is evil, that has led to our present day understanding of uh, morality. Even what we take to be like sort of innate or almost pre given more moral feelings or moral judgment, a sense of duty, etc., that we saw last week, or the sense of happiness as a measure of happiness, greatest happiness for the greatest number. This sort of moral feeling or these moral judgments or moral sentiments are not just something that innately exist in us. Rather, he thinks they're deeply historical, the products of past historical struggles. And that is what he's going to try to trace here, this to begin with, these historical origins of morality. That, another way to put it, these moralities are vestiges or an atavism of earlier codes and practices of moral conduct. So we have to look at the histories and cultures or peoples, ranks, types of individuals, etc. So we have to really not simply think of some absolute universal or something that apply a general notion of morality, but these ideas of morality are tied to particular historical conditions, cultural conditions, particular classes of people, particular types of individuals, and so on. So we need to delve into all of these if we want to truly explore the historical origins, struggles, and conditions under which morality comes up and then may even decline over time. So, if on the one hand, as I just mentioned, if excavating the historical origins of morality already appears as a major theme in his treatment of the subject. The other major theme that appears already is investigating the very sort of value or worthiness of morality itself. As he puts it, under what conditions did man invent the value judgments good and evil? So, in other words, these are not, as I just mentioned, just something pre given, but something invented by human beings and invented under particular historical conditions. So, we need to explore those in order to get a sense why these judgments about good and evil appear the way they do to us. And he wants to then take it further and ask, and what value do they themselves have? In fact, as we'll see, this will become a common theme in the morality types of morality he's criticizing. He'll in fact argue maybe these traditional moralities or the moralities that are subject of his critique are actually not good for us. Have they up to now obstructed or promoted human flourishing? It's a question he wants to take up. I mean, if you remember, this is sort of the Aristotelian theme already in here, morality, goodness associated with human flourishing. And he wants to even very basic question that basic assumption that ethics is about human flourishing. He's saying, well, maybe, or has it really promoted human flourishing, these ideas that we have about morality, or maybe it has obstructed human flourishing? Are they a sign of distress, poverty, degeneration of life? Or do they reveal the fullness, the strength and will of life, its courage, its confidence, its future? See, it's almost like he's reopening the whole, wanting to sort of reevaluate the very idea of ethics and morality to begin with. And and the particularly the morality that he is criticizing, we're calling it traditional morality. In the next lecture we'll see a term, and sometimes I'll start using it here, so I'll mention that as a shortcut to talk about the types of morality he's criticizing, is when he's talking about morality in a bad sense or morality in a pejorative sense. Because, as I've said, he also uses morality in a positive sense for the types of morality he seems to be proposing. So we'll have to explore that. So when we say traditional morality or morality in a pejorative sense, we are talking about the types of moralities that he's criticizing. So, or something fundamental about a wide range of moralities: Kantian, utilitarian, religious Christian morality, and so on, European, modern European morality, etc. He finds something characteristically, uh, 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 how should I put it, something characteristically wanting or lacking in these moralities that may in fact turn out, as he'll go on to argue, even harmful for us. So, I'll again read the second quote also. So that morality itself were to blame if man as species never reached his highest potential power and splendor. So that morality itself was the danger of dangers. So this is here is referring to the morality that he's finding, at fault. So we actually really start with a basic question that we'll keep coming back to in a number of ways, a number of times. This notion that is sort of one of our central questions. Uh, is Nietzsche arguing against the possibility or the value of all values? Is he arguing against our value of all morality? Or is he proposing that no, there are certain life affirming values, certain values for life? Because as you noticed from the previous quotation, he seems to think that there are certain values or certain moralities that may be harmful to life, to human life. So, and he wants to counterpose these to certain values he thinks is positive or for life, advantageous for our living, sort of certain type of vitalism that brings out the sort of vital strength, health in human beings. So this question remains: is he against all morality, or is he against a certain uh, characteristics of all these traditional moralities while proposing certain life affirming morality, something that brings out the best in humans? So now he himself doesn't claim to know what is good and evil, as we'll see. But what he'll try to show us is how these judgments of what is good and what is evil come about through past historical struggles that we have somehow just latched on to even today. So we'll come back to that shortly. And he suspects that traditional morality, uh, and again, here on the traditional morality, by and large, in this text which we are turning to, Genealogy of Morals. In fact, all those quotations on top are all from this text, one of his most mature texts in his mature period, uh, that where he captures sort of these central ideas and his turn to a critique of morality. That here he'll basically argue that whether it's Christian morality, secular utilitarian morality, Kantian morality, modern European morality, etc., he argues that there's something characteristic about all these moral normative systems that's actually of little or no value for human life. And this is what he refers to as nihilism or nihilism. The belief that nothing is of intrinsic value, that there is no universal or absolute foundation of value. So he basically attacks these traditional morality, and in particular, as I said, he attacks particular characteristics of this morality, as he will argue. Well, sure, as we will encounter, that these traditional moralities that command us to be meek and humble, to look out for the weak, to help the weak and the poor and the less fortunate in society. He'll argue that these traditional codes of morality, whether we're looking at Christian morality or utilitarian morality or Kantian morality, these are dangerous because he'll argue these deny life and the conditions of life and instead lead to a certain kind of passivity. It makes us passive human beings. It leads to all of us individuals conforming with the social good, creates a herd mentality. And he argues that this poses a danger to the interests, to the health, and the powers of the individual, and it clogs and deadens the human spirit. Now, this is a lot we are throwing out right at the beginning. Now, we'll spend the rest of this lecture and the next breaking this down further. Now, his analysis in the text, Genealogy of Morals, and you'll be reading the first essay from the Genealogy of Morals, which is called Good and Evil, comma, Good and Bad. Here he turns to a critique of the so-called English psychologists. By this, Nietzsche has really the utilitarian philosophers in mind. Utilitarian philosophers and utilitarian economists, from Adam Smith to Bentham, Mills, and so on. He argues that they locate the effective motive forces of human development in the inertia of habit, in forgetfulness, in blind ideas, that we're always in something that is purely passive, automatic, reflexive, and, as he would put it, profoundly stupid. What is he getting at? Nietzsche argues that they fail to understand that these habits that we have and these sort of unconscious dispositions that we have are not simply innate or permanently fixed elements of human nature. This feeling pain, avoiding pain, trying to strive for pleasure. He says these have just become habitual. It just makes us passive human beings. We are all trying to do this. Then we are trying to reach the greatest pleasure for the greatest amount of human beings, greatest number of beings, and so on. He's like, where did all these feelings come from? That we should extol only pleasure and pleasure for everybody. We should give charity, help others, and so on. Keep promises. Many of the sort of Kantian and utilitarian things we have seen. He says, rather than being universal values, these are just habits that have formed in us. These unconscious habits, they're not simply innate or permanently fixed elements of our human nature, but rather products of specific historical developments. He argues that morality and its valuations are already finished historical products from struggles of an earlier age. So this is what he wants to uncover. And he used this sort of genealogical approach, meaning he'll excavate, uncovering genealogy of even our simplest moral feelings or judgments that we want to trace historically obscured dimensions of our moral sentiments. So, once again, what utilitarians, he would argue, what utilitarian philosophers view as innate moral feelings or sentiments as if it's just given in us are really sort of atavisms or throwbacks or recurrence of traits that have just been passed down to us, are vestiges of complex social conditions in the past that transformed and, in the process of transforming, concealed even earlier codes and practices of moral conduct. In other words, he's arguing that what we take today to be innate moral feelings are outcomes of past struggles between different codes and practices of morality. And those outcomes, have since, the sort of the winning outcomes, winning codes and practices, now we take as if they're sort of innate in all human beings. So, what utilitarians call the individual's personal moral feelings, he argues, are actually internalized value systems of the quote, many society. This is going to be a sort of big target of his criticisms, that we pursue the morality of the herd, that this is what keeps civil society at peace. All of us pursuing these certain uh, moral conducts, being humble, being helping others, seeking the good of others, and so on. That these are part of a herd morality, that in a value system of the many society, rather than focusing on the individual. And he says these are, we have been just morally conditioned into these. These are not innate or even universal human nature, by no means. It's something that's been drilled into us, this sort of obedience to traditional customs. That the moral content of our conscience are formed quite early during our childhood, and it demands our compulsion without giving reason, especially when we're young, to imitate those we fear and those we honor. Parents and authority, the school figure, and then the laws, authority, and then the state, and so on. You know. And then as adults, we seek to find reasons for these moral feelings. So that's when we develop concepts, moral concepts, using our reason of good and bad, pleasure and pain, right and wrong, duty, and so on. That these moral concepts, then we apply to this what we think are innate moral feelings. But he says these are hardly innate moral feelings. We have been trained into these, and we just blindly obey them. You know, an obedience that has been drilled into us from a young age, through uh, our understanding of fear and honor. And then he turns to a particular aspect of this morality, and he's here again. He's doing a critique of the what he called the English psychologists, the utilitarians, and he says the moral values of the English. That in these moral values, the truly good is to do good things for others, charity, pity, humility, and so on. That personal pleasure is derived from an unegoistic act of disinterested virtue. One feels better or more moral if one does good for others. Now, I won't go into it in great detail here because he doesn't touch this here, but elsewhere we also see, and we see it in sort of other writers in a different form, in Karl Marx as well, uh, is that this morality emerges in the context otherwise of an emergent industrial social contractarian society, which encourages us all to be egoistic and pursue our self interest. Adam Smith, for example, in his classic text, The Wealth of Nations, begins with this argument that each individual pursues their own self interest, and yet, through the invisible workings of the market, the so called invisible hand, and so on, the wealth of nations increases through the equilibrium of demand and supply, and so on. But the question always remains for Adam Smith. That well then if we are all pursuing, and not just Adam Smith, these other utilitarians, and in fact other contractarian theories, that if we are all by human nature pursuing our self-interest, where does our moral sentiments come from? And then we get a variety of answers, by and large, whether it's universalist or innate human nature and so on that give rise to our moral sentiments. These are the elements that Nietzsche is questioning. Because in this traditional utilitarian framework, what we are seeing is this idea that we live in a highly egoistic society. The society, in fact, just thrives through each of us pursuing our own self interest, being egoistic. Yet then, in this egoistic society, a society of egoistic individuals, where does this morality of doing good for others, this altruist or unegoistic act come from? And as we have seen so far, whether it's labeled as human nature or universal sentiments and so on, those have often been used to trace the sort of sources of this morality. Nietzsche is arguing that no, we need to trace the sources of this morality to specific historical struggles of the past. And indeed, he argues that this idea that we should do, that truly good is to do good for others, help others, give charity, and so on, as we have already encountered, even in Kant, and even before that in the utilitarians, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, and so on. Nietzsche argues that this is actually a fairly late historical development, this idea that we should interpret or judge values and morality in terms of its effects on others. And he says this is also nice, taking it a step further, something this last part we'll evaluate next lecture, is that, and this is largely due to the inability to impose our own will and bring about things what we truly desire for our own selves. So he's really, giving this a, sort of, twist here. That this idea that morality, that the highest good is to do good for others, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, or it's your duty to help others, and so on, that this is a relatively recent historical development where we have started to value morality uh, in terms of its effects on others rather than what it does for me. And here he says this is also largely because we are actually unable to impose our own will. Like Kant, remember, was talking in the previous lecture about will, that your own maxim becomes the universal law. He's going to be arguing here, uh, in a different, slightly different context with a direct reference, but we will see the linkages. That it's due to our inability to impose our own will and do what we really want to for something that I want, that I desire. Our inability to do that is largely leads us to this tradition and this relatively new morality. And Nietzsche locates this inability and weakness at the very origin, heart of Western morality, which is the Christian tradition, he'll argue. It's a Christian tradition begins with a change, or what he calls a disruption, a sharp breakage taking place, which leads to a complete revaluation of previously existing values, such that action is no longer judged according to our own end or life, but rather in terms of its effects on others. Do good for others, and so on. So he argues an inversion is taking place here. From positive imposition of values, that I do this because it's good for me, to a negative reception. So from something is good because I do it to something is good because it helps others.